Okay, hello everybody. Today we are going to have a discussion about education systems. What does it mean to be knowledgeable, educated, and why is that important for humanity? And and in our own eyes, where is it going wrong? Where is there progress? And before we get into that discussion, where I have a series of questions that revolve around that, I want to give our featured guest a moment to introduce herself and talk about the organization that she started up, and I'll give a little brief introduction of myself momentarily afterwards. So let's get started.
Well, thank you again for having me. I am Izzie. Also, Elizabeth is my actual name, but my friends call me Izzie. I started the organization called Critic, which stands for Children Represented in Culture, where we believe that everyone has a child inside of them that deserves to be loved on. So I have a background in family therapy, so I decided to start this organization to bring awareness to mental health and personal well-being in my home community. So thank you again, Jesse, for having me today.
Yes, thank you for making the time to join me and have this conversation. So, a little introduction of myself in case there are people watching my content for the first time. I call myself an independent researcher of sorts. What I do is I go through academic literature, and I try to find data sets that correspond to the literature I'm working with. I build complex systems models, and I try to put models together with data and put out information that's relevant to different problem domains, like how can we tackle like different problems in different sectors, like in terms of business, in terms of foundations of science, and all different issues that really prioritizing like where are the important problem domains and how can we provide insight to those domains. So I guess you could say it's sort of like consulting, kind of like a consultant analytics sort of variety of things that I do, and I am in the process of trying to start a career in analytics in some fashion, realistically. But I found myself being affiliated with a nonprofit organization known as the Active Inference Institute, and I'm focusing on publishing papers in the cognitive sciences. But anyway, let's get to some of these interesting questions. So, what are your thoughts on the role and function of education systems?
Thoughts on the role of the education system.
Mm-hmm.
So, um, just to pinpoint, what I hear when I say the role of the education system is, obviously to educate, but what are they educating the kids on? So I feel like you have your basic structure, which is through primary and secondary, which is your math, your English, your science, your history. Did I miss one? Math, English, science, history. Your basic core curriculum. So educate the kids on that. But then you have more of the elective side, where kids can kind of, explore a little bit more outside of that box that they have created. So I think there's also a social piece to it, whether they're directly or indirectly trying to teach the social piece. Kids learn, through the education system, how to socialize. I think that's the role they play now. I think some of the things are kind of defaulted to because of the structure, right? If you have a bunch of kids in one school, they are obligated to socialize. Whether they're being taught the skills on how to properly socialize, I think that's a different conversation. So I think that's more of a circumstances based as to why that's happening. Education system, that's a fun one. I think, there's a lot of funding that goes into play. We could talk about different socioeconomic statuses and how that funding works. Specifically speaking about the public school system, that role they play, it is a thing that our tax dollars go to. So, they are a public entity. so I think that's another role that they play, that, you have the school board meetings, and, the citizens get a chance to uh, voice their opinions, and, we the people kind of, give um, input and insight on how we want those things to operate. So, yeah, that is the roles I think they play.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you followed the history of how populations and, even I think a large focus of the education system now is really uh, the result of the industrial revolution, and making sure enough of the population is adept enough, not to say adaptable, but adept, like ADEPT, like quote unquote, that they have some bare minimum way of being able to communicate socially, even if they're working some minimum wage job, that what we call them now, minimum wage jobs, and I think that in general, I think there's a lot of rigidity. As somebody that struggles a lot with moderate to severe autism, I when I grew up, I was in special education program, and I got diagnosed with ADHD, but I got a later diagnosis for autism, but they call it AUDHD, autism ADHD comorbidity, which I guess is still in the medical literature, but it's kind of like everybody's like AUDHD now because they don't want to say autism and ADHD. It's easier to say AUDHD, and I think with me, I could speak volumes from my experience, but the problem with autism spectrum and neurodevelopmental conditions, especially with children, right? Because they're trying to understand the world from a more naive point of view than we do. But I struggle so much with reading comprehension and what have you, and that kind of haunted me a bit, because I the whole curriculum structure focused environment in higher education, that just kind of is very similar but more rigid compared to public education. Like public education, they kind of handhold you a bit. It's like, okay, you're a kid, and then there's this higher expectation when you're in higher education that, like, okay, you're in a program, you're taking all these courses. Some of them are not necessarily core requisites, but like you take your humanities courses and all that. And I think there's just so much, and there's a lot of debate in the philosophy of science literature about like how certain fields of academia are too rigid and very narrow, where tackling serious problems, advancing different fields can be problematic. But I won't get into all that. You mentioned a bit about public education. What about your thoughts on like the role of higher education? And like, I don't know if you followed the history behind that, but I figured you spoke about public education, but like about higher education. How do you feel about higher education?
I think it should be free. I'll start off by being quite upfront about that one. I don't think that people should have to. It should be a right. It should be a right for people to be able to achieve that higher education. Like you said, it is a very um, handheld process, but then it's like almost after that, 18 years of hand holding, it's like, okay, well, now you sign up for this loan, you gotta do this, and it's just like, whoa, are we pushing them into adulthood? Well, that could have been a course, taught in the high school and the younger grades. So I think it's a giant leap that these kids are taking, and I commend any child that is trying to, further their education and build their knowledge. Um, but I think that it can be scary for them going in, and then once you talk about pushing these kids out into like these scenarios, then you talk about what are the mental health rates look like, what are the mental health resources within campuses, and I think it could be a smoother transition for them to enter into adulthood, because then I also feel like once they're in the higher education system, it's like, okay, well, most of these jobs want 3 years of experience and whatever requirements, and it's like, okay, well, we didn't give them the tools to be able to do that. So it's almost like there's a gap that I see between each of the steps that I feel like can be resolved. Enough people are having conversations like this to the point where we know that there's information out there, we know that there's money out there, we know there's resources out there. Why is it not being utilized?
Yeah, well, how they are being utilized, but I don't know if you know anybody who struggles in a learning, quote unquote, learning system environment, right? Because I feel like there's a difference between education and like the ability to learn in your own way that works for you. And for me, I figured that out a little later in life than I would have hoped. And even like when like growing up, I felt like there was like this bad, like there wasn't really much incentive for me to just pick up a book and learn. I had this problem where I didn't get along with kids, and like the classroom was very unmotivated environment, and I had a problem with playing video games a lot. You know, I come home, it's like I escape to the virtual world, and like I don't play video games anymore. It became a problem for prioritizing my life, and I also kind of got, I kind of grew out of it in a sense. It's like I look back and I'm like, okay, that's a chapter that I'm happy that I'm done and over with. But at the same time, I felt like there was this delayed developmental issue I had because I didn't feel like I was incentivized to really pick up a book and go through it. And I have a hard time even going through novels, and I'm a slow reader myself, so like reading comprehension can be a little difficult. And that's why I like to prioritize different modes of learning, like audio-visual and kinesthetic learning. Like I think I showed you some of my art like a long time ago when I met you. But I think that and I'm not sure how well. Where are you in terms of? So there's this idea of educability, which I don't know if Leslie Valiant, he's like a computer scientist. I don't know if he coined the term, but it's like the limits in which individual people can understand the depth of the subject and like just engaging with the world around them. And that kind of gets to this idea where I was thinking about, okay, well, how do we all engage with the world in our own way? And God forbid, like some of us, like myself, like have a hard time in engaging with these education system based curriculum structured environments because they're so rigid. There's no room for me to really explore and play with information and understand and come to a convergent means of understanding it a similar or same way that other people do. And I think it's tough to provide an argument for that for people that want to be doctors and practice medicine, because I think like that's a life or death scenario where like it's the rigidity kind of does matter, because like it could be a life or death situation, and like in terms of following protocol and procedure, I get that, and holding people liable for the work that they do, I get that too. But I feel like there should be alternatives. There should be alternative systems that can test people into different fields of work. But in terms of like how this plays into educability and like how this varies with education, I'm concerned. I'm curious about like how you feel about that. Maybe you agree with what I have to say, and whether you know people that really struggle with learning that are on the autism spectrum, or they're dealing with some other problem that impinges on their ability to learn. But anyway, not to go off. I can go on a tangent, but I want to give you some time to speak your thoughts on that.
I think you brought up a lot of great points, so I'm going to try to pinpoint kind of what the takeaways that I got, because you said such amazing things. So I think the educability you said.
Educability. So like
educability.
The limits in which individuals are able to learn the depth of the subject, or other subjects like compound learning things.
So I think with that one for me, it's like I hear it, but I don't want to receive it because it almost seems like a cap that we're putting on people. But I also wanted to like pinpoint what you said, the different learning styles.
Mm.
I think if there is more representation of people who think like you and me, that we would be able to almost help bridge that gap to prepare them for these fields. I don't feel like there is enough representation with people with neurodivergent learning styles, thinking, processing, that it makes it harder for the kids who feel like, who do have, these strong difficulties at those young ages, that they can do more. I don't want to cap them. I feel like, we just got to get the right people in there teaching them and talking about the different learning styles, because like you said, it took you later in life to learn what learning styles work best for you. I was blessed enough to have a mother who did recognize my different learning styles. So very early on, I was categorizing things, color coding things, making flashcards, and, really getting my niches down so it could help me be prepared for whatever situation, and it made me adaptable. I know we talked about being adept earlier, but I think it's almost both ends of the spectrum when it comes to those two words. That I was able to be adaptable because I learned those skills so early on, and then it kind of almost elevated me because I knew I could use it as a superpower. And I think we just have to instill that in the kids who have neurodivergent learning style, that they have superpowers. That's how I look at it.
Yeah, I think that I think one of the problems, just to kind of play devil's advocate a little bit here, it's not to say that that the system is intentionally working against these people per se. I think that part of the problem in terms of representation of people who do struggle with neurodivergence is that, especially when we're talking about the autism spectrum, and I don't want to generalize that those who are neurodivergent lie on the autism spectrum. People with ADHD don't necessarily have autism. People that are dyslexic and so forth, even though a lot of these different conditions are a lot of people that have autism have these other difficulties. It's not to say that it's always present in those people, and the people that do have the people that are on the autism spectrum. It's a whole spectrum, right? And there's a well represented population of people on the autism spectrum that do well in higher education environments and whatnot. The real difficulty, I think, from my experience and from most people that I've met, is communication and social skills difficulties, right? Because even when you get a job, and it's hard to be a people, I don't want to say people pleasing person, but communication can be difficult. And for me, even communicating knowledge and information, right? Just having the right mentors and whatnot, and talking to the right, being affiliated with the right communities of people for in terms of what you're trying to learn and engage yourself in. That matters too. If there's no good comprehensiveness of communication, that's a difficulty on one end. But it's one thing for me to communicate effectively with people that I relate to and people in the academic world, but then I have difficulty communicating with people in the business world and the more casual world, right? People that don't spend time using big words and talking to people that are very scholarly. When I'm in if I go to a bar and I'm it's hard for me to relate to a lot of people because a lot of those people they don't think about philosophy and all that stuff and using all these big words and talking about all these big things. A lot of people don't relate to that, so it's I think a really hard time even with learning is relating to the content. But I think
that's a great point.
Yeah,
I think that's
a problem.
Why I went into the psychology realm, right? Because of the social element that comes along with psychology, right? The social psychology. So, with that being said, I think that maybe to advocate to your point, Um, Maybe if there was more education on those social, so remember how I told you that the education system is there because that framework at default kids are taught to socialize or have to socialize, but they're not really being taught on how to socialize. So imagine if we fed into the social and emotional aspect more than just the academic portion, right? Because they're both influential and they're both different types of knowledge, right? You have IQ and EQ, but to prepare kids for the more social settings. And I used to be a therapeutic staff support, and that's just basically a one-on-one for kids on the autism spectrum. But I worked with early intervention kiddos, so that means they were 2 years old to 4.5 years old. So that toddler age before they enter to kindergarten, right? So they're just learning how to speak. They're just learning how to feed themselves. And I literally, it was one of the most gratifying jobs I've ever had, where I got to play with the kids and read them social stories on what it is to play with another kid. So breaking it down to kindergarten. Can I have, and really giving them a baseline on how to, have that social skill later on in life, because it can be a struggle for people on the spectrum when it comes to their social skills. So, those skills are being taught with that service, because it's a state service, right? The child has to be gone through the evaluation and get the diagnosis from the psychiatrist or from the pediatrician. Then you have to then apply for said services, and how many hours do you get per month, which agency has staffing that's availability, because I'm telling you, turnover was bad when I was there. You just come in and out the door, and it's just kids are getting acclimated. So it's there's a good side and there's a bad side to everything, I will say that. But we do have the skills. It's just a matter, like you said, using those resources in a different way.
Yeah, that kind of rolls into the next question regarding problems with standardization, like how we regulate, ways of presenting knowledge, and whether or not there's there should be a means in which it should be more free-flowing and improvised for people who deal with neurodivergence. I feel like a one-size-fits-all approach is not going to work for everybody. I mean, you have your ways of learning, I have my ways of learning, and I think one of the bottlenecks that we have to deal with, that and I guess this is to the extreme, depending on what is the data saying about the general population regarding, okay, well, are kids in public school environments, or even those who went through private schooling, or they were homeschooled, how does standardization impact them, right? Because these are different environments, and even in the higher education environment, in terms of not just standardization, but even testing knowledge. I feel like there's a difference between memorizing and understanding information. It's one thing to regurgitate something, and then, okay, I get an A on the test, and I forget about all this stuff moments later, right? I'm not sure if you experienced that issue, but
yes.
Pushing people to okay, you gotta study for the test, but really, I think studying should be pretty much the mode of how we study should be how we understand, not just cramming things into our head and call it a day. It's what's the point if study habits are just memorization habits? I guess I'm interested in what you think about that ordeal.
It's funny hearing you speak, and not funny in a ha-ha way, but funny in a happy way, right? You ever see the Divergent series, where they have the different quads that people belong to based on their personality type, their interaction style, but so you had I think it was Donjin or something like that, and they were the people who were really muscly and active, so they it's almost like a post-apocalyptic type of movie, but they had different sectors. So they were the military, then you had the people who were the caretakers, then you had people who were the business workers, and then you have people who are like the judges. So I think, as you were talking, I was like, would it be beneficial to give kids the ASVAB test earlier on in life, to help maybe guide them a little bit? That would be interesting. I think it's different over the generations. This is just my personal viewpoint. I feel like, we're the same age, right? Millennials. With that being said, I think, the generation before us, I'm most familiar with like the baby boomers, like they are less, they were less educated when it comes to mental health, right? And then I felt like millennials, we were like other experimental kids, like, maybe there is something that is not as status quo as I thought when it came to, my child. And then I feel like, you got the Gen Zs then, and it's just like, okay, it seems almost like a trend now. So it's like, things have always been around. And I think that, again, I guess I'm going to stick to my guns, I like that there's more options. I will say that. I like that there's more options. I like that, charter schools are becoming more of a thing, because I used to teach at a charter school out in Emmaus. It's called 7 Generations. And it's a beautiful school, and they're very alternative. Like, their jungle gym is made out of all the type of materials. So you got tires in there. You have, old, poles that were bent. They have a garden. They have, they're really providing their children other opportunities and ways to learn based off of the differences within each of these children, trying to speak to them in different ways. So I love the fact that there's charter schools. I love the fact that there's charter schools like that one. And I feel like, if you're homeschooling, that is truly up to the parent. I love homeschooling, but I think it's a lot of work if the parent is doing it themselves. Have the accessibility to public school and to put your kid in different things outside of the normal structure. And then it's like the kids who are at public schools are kind of left to their own devices, and pray to God that they have a good home that they go home to.
So the right role models and all that is definitely important.
Or what their home situation even looks like. So yeah, I think there's options today.
Yeah, but I think one of the big issues that I see is the just lack of incentive for people to be communal focused, to care about others. Like, especially we live in America, and there's this, everybody talks about independence, right? And it's like people take it way overboard, where it's like, okay, I'm gonna be independent. Like I can't rely on people, but at the end of the day, humanity is communal. We're social animals. Like we have to communicate and work together, and it kind of defeats the purpose if we're just looking after ourselves. And it's like, I'm just worrying about myself. I don't care about anybody else. But then it's like, okay, but then you're deceiving yourself in the long run. And I feel like that, in terms of learnability and educability, that limits people's prospects and like what they can do if they choose to not have that communal mindset and be focused on themselves. But additionally, I feel like, given the problems of standardization, there was another talking point I had in mind, but I'm going to move on to this next talking point. I feel like there used to be the master and apprentice era before the age of industry just came rolling along, and we're putting everybody through public and public schooling, and even the role of higher education, the role of colleges and universities used to be solely for the pursuit of knowledge. Like back in the feudal era and all that, like you had the nobles that had access to university life and colleges, and the nobles that went to college and university, like their role was to become scientists and philosophers and understand the world around them. And now we're just, it's like we're putting pressure on these systems that had that more genuine role to like actually explore and help humanity, to like, okay, well, you're going to train the workforce. It's like I just think, like, personally, I have a problem with that. I think there needs to be a more separable system that's like, okay, you have a system that's focused on higher education in terms of the pursuit of knowledge and helping humanity, and then there's the people that, people that are going to work and provide services and whatnot to population on a business level and industry level. I think that's different. So I guess I have an unorthodox view in thinking, well, there's this problem with education where higher, the colleges and universities, they had this more genuine and chivalrous, but honorable aesthetic to them. It's like, we're going to try and help humanity and get people to understand the world around them and help each other. I will say that the days of the feudal era were quite cruel, and if you weren't a noble, you were not treated right. So at least we don't live in that era. But what we lost in terms of the value of higher education, I think is important to recognize. But I think that kind of also ties into this master and apprentice dynamic that I feel like we're going back to, because to some degree anyway, because standardization doesn't work for everybody, and then people have different learning styles, and then they find mentors, and then, like, okay, they might have multiple masters, and then they have apprentices, and they pass on their knowledge, right? So I'm interested in what you think about that and the role of that, and
I think when you talk about how, sorry, you broke up for a little bit. I think when you talk about the